Okay, Mr. Michael, thank you for being with us. So we have here a Catholic intellectual, a writer, political commentator, and author and editor of Culture Wars magazine, Mr. Michael Jones. So, thank you and
Thank
welcome.
you.
Welcome.
Good to be here.
Okay, so today's topic is Međugorje. But before we start, I just wanted to ask you if you have any kind of connections, contacts with the former Yugoslavian republics, or any interests in this.
Actually, this is interesting because I just did a show on RT, the Russian TV station, on Macedonia. There's a color revolution going on in Macedonia right now. And we discussed that, and then I got this angry response from some lady, a Macedonian living in Canada. And we got into an interesting discussion about the state of Macedonia. What is Macedonia right now? Is it a state, or is it a province? And I said, I think she was offended by asking the question. But Macedonia came into existence in 1991, and it was created by NATO and the United States when they dismembered Yugoslavia.
Okay, well,
and so what we're talking about here geopolitically, and this is Međugorje played a big role in this, was basically the destruction of Yugoslavia.
Okay.
And why Yugoslavia was destroyed and who was involved in the destruction of Yugoslavia. So I entered into this discussion in the mid-1980s, so around 30 years ago. Because at this point, Catholics from all over the United States had heard about Međugorje. Suddenly these brochures were appearing, full-color brochures with these attractive, they were children at the time, and there was all of this talk about the Blessed Mother appearing in some place in Yugoslavia. This had just followed on the heels of the news we had gotten from Poland at this time about solidarity. If you remember those days, there was the occupation of the Lenin shipyard in Gdańsk, and there were pictures of all these Polish workers going to confession to the priests out there in the open air. A direct challenge to the communist regime. This was also when Ronald Reagan was in the White House. So it was an exciting time. Everybody thought that we're nearing the final days of the Soviet hegemony. Communism was going to fall, and that's, I think, what energized people's interest in the apparitions in Međugorje.
Well, just maybe you asked about Macedonia. According to the 174 Constitution of Yugoslavia, you had 6 republics that, under the former Yugoslav Constitution, had the right on self-determination. So. And the protests in Croatia that they were called Croatian Spring, it was a starting of Croatian national awareness, started around 71. So it's a big topic. Maybe I would like to stay focused as we possibly can on the Međugorje phenomena.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, you can. I mean, you can also expand, but. So you don't have any contacts, connections, or interests around here in this region before 81.
Well, no, not before 1981. I arrived in Mostar in 1988.
Okay.
There was something to just back up a little bit. I started what was then Fidelity magazine, which is now Culture Wars magazine, in 1981. Which is the same year that the apparitions started in Međugorje. So I had been hearing the news about this and had become more and more involved, and people were pressing me to go because they wanted to know what my opinion was. I had been to Fatima in 1983, which is, I think, the year after the Pope had been there and there was an assassination attempt on the Pope. So I had some sense, I believe that the Blessed Mother did appear in Fatima. I still believe that. And that became a kind of measuring rod for the way I was going to deal with Međugorje. So I knew it was a limited number of times. I knew what she had to say. You could look up the messages. And then I started to try and get to the bottom of Međugorje, and I realized this is like what the Germans call ein Fass ohne Boden, a barrel without a bottom. I couldn't get my arms around what was going on, the messages. So I decided I have to go over. I have to try and investigate the situation myself. So in May of 1988, I was sitting there in Mostar, in a park in Mostar, and I remember looking up at the mountain across the Neretva, and there was in stone written on the top of the mountain was Tito. You'll have to help me here. Volumute, we love you, Tito.
Yes, it's
Written in stones on top of the mountain. So I was looking at that. Tito had died 1 year before the apparitions began, 1980. And I then got to meet with the Bishop of Mostar. His name was Pavel Zanic at the time. And he told me in no uncertain terms that he had investigated a thing. He was convinced that it was a fraud. And he was convinced that these children, these so-called seers, were basically puppets of the Franciscans. And then he got into the whole story about this rebellious order of Franciscans in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is a long story, and it was basically the first time that I heard about that.
yes.
That was 1988, May of 1988. And that's when I started to do the investigation. So for the entire summer of 1988, I was, this is before computers. We couldn't Skype with anybody. So I'm back and forth trying to find out the story here, because you could not find the story from the information that they were disseminating. There was it was a fundamental, what should I say, a fundamentally deceptive operation. And it became clear to me as soon as I got involved that the Franciscans were the main authors of this deception. They were involved they had something that they wanted to get out of these things. And so the more I looked into it, the more the story that they were telling did not make sense. During this summer, I made contact with a Franciscan priest by the name of Ivo Sivrich, who was from Međugorje, who knew the whole story. He was a villager, grew up in Međugorje, knew the story, and did not go along, did not agree with the rebellion that was going on in that particular order of the Franciscans. He was working with a Frenchman by the name of Louis Bélanger, who was from Montreal. And together they brought out a book called La Face Cachée du Međugorje, the Hidden Face of Međugorje. And the important thing about this book was that in the back of it, Sivrich had translated all of the tape recordings that had taken place in the beginning. Tape recordings that the bishop had made with the seers, that various people had made with the seers. And what you saw was just total contradiction, totally preposterous claims, a kind of incoherence of what was going on. I mean, you have to remember, get some sense of remembering what was happening here. This is 1 year after Tito has died. There's all this ferment coming from Poland at this point. Everybody's aware that there's something happening in the communist world. The people hear that the Blessed Mother has appeared, and all of a sudden this spontaneous assembly starts taking place. People from all over Yugoslavia start coming to Međugorje, and there's a little hole in the ground, and they start throwing money, their dinars, into this little hole in the ground. There's this kind of euphoria that is taking place, and Međugorje is sort of the focus of this euphoria. And everyone's caught up in something that they find too big to control, too big to understand. So at this point, this becomes clear when you read the transcripts of those original interviews. There are two priests there at the parish, at St. James Parish in Međugorje, Jozo Zovko and Tomislav Vlasic.
Mm-hmm.
Both of these people have very troubled personal histories. Jozo Zovko was how can I say this? He was a flaming supporter of the Ustasha. He would say Mass. When he'd say Mass, he would put the gear on the altar, which was a crime in Yugoslavia at that point, a deliberately provocative act. And he got arrested and became a kind of martyr in that regard. Tomislav Lasic had his own baggage. Tomislav Lasic was a charismatic. He had lived in a Franciscan community in Zagreb, and there was a nun there, an attractive nun, and she ended up getting pregnant by Lasic. Then she moved to Germany. The son was born there, and she lived with some German guy in Germany. Over the course of the summer of 1988, I called her on the phone. I talked to her. I talked to her son. And so what you see here, a different picture began to emerge over the summer of 1988. They were both committed to. They both had personal issues that they were bringing to this apparition, and I think both of them saw some type of advantage in the apparition. The fundamental truth about apparitions is that the children never control them. The children invariably get taken over by some type of priest. And when the priest says it's okay, that's when the apparition begins. And that's what happened during this period, the earliest period, after the apparitions began in 1981.
Just a question.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. I keep talking.
Okay.
Ask me a question.
So yeah, basically from the start there. So your impression is that it never were something spontaneous. That from the very start it was orchestrated by Franciscans, or it was some.
Not from the very start. I think the children got caught doing something that they shouldn't have been doing. I suspect that they were smoking dope. They were smoking. The one lady, the oldest, Mirjana, she was called the Punkaritsa. And in the dialogue, in the interviews, the word Punkaritsa kept appearing. I thought, what's a Punkaritsa? And I asked Severich, and he said, I don't know. He didn't know what the... And suddenly I realized what it means, what it is punker. Yeah. This was the time of the Sex Pistols in England, and the rebellious teenagers were called punker, and if they were girls, they were called punkaritsa. And that's the reputation that she had because she had gone to the university, I forget where, maybe in Zagreb. Anyway, she came back, she had this reputation. I think the children were caught doing something, and they started lying from the beginning so that they wouldn't get caught, and it got out of control. And by the time the priest got involved, it was a mass phenomenon all over Yugoslavia, and the kids were, as Father Severich said, they were riding the back of a tiger. You know, it's easy to ride the tiger, it's difficult to get off the tiger. And that's what was going on at this point, and I think this is the moment where the priests saw their moment of opportunity. So Jozo Zovko is interviewing the children, and he catches them in one lie after another. By the way, this is all documented in the book. I wrote 2 books. The Međugorje, The Untold Story, that was written in 1988. And then 8 years later, I went back and wrote The Međugorje Deception in 1996. So I document this in both of those books. But anyway, at this point, Zovko says, have the apparitions in the church. That's the turning point. That's the moment when the Franciscans took it over, and that's when they started using it for their political ends. Okay? At that point, the children became pawns in the game, that in the battle that the Franciscans were waging against the Bishop of Mostar. From that point on, all of the messages got strained through the Franciscans, who all studied theology, and anything that they said which was absurd, they said all these absurd stories at the beginning, they all got strained out. And now it was the Franciscans who took it over.
About the messages, what were the content of the messages compared, for example, with ones in Fatima, and what was the theological strength or consistency of the messages itself in the first phase?
There was no coherence whatsoever to the messages. The messages were completely banal and stupid. There was no real revelation. If you go back to Fatima, what was the purpose of Fatima? The purpose of Fatima was to talk about the advent of communism. A new era dawned in the church with the Russian Revolution. Those children could never have known about the Russian Revolution, but it took place at the same time of the Fatima revelations.
on je pričao
And so the era of Fatima was the era of communism. And the Blessed Mother came to warn the world about the rise of communism and said that communism would take over more and more as long as the rest of the world stayed away from the faith. That was clear. It was very to the point. There was a hidden part of the message that came out later, but it was very short to the point, and it lasted 6 months. The Međugorje messages at the beginning were preposterous. There were stories about the bloody handkerchief. The Blessed Mother said that Ivan, or one of the kids, the other kid, I forget what his name was, Yakov, picked up a bloody handkerchief, and if he had dropped it into the pool, to the river there, it would have meant the end of the world. Well, all these messages got strained out by the Franciscans, which meant that the children were not saying things that were absurd now, but they weren't saying anything anymore. So it's always, my children, pray, pray, pray. Thank you for responding to my call. The end of story. And this goes on forever, thousands, tens of thousands of messages that say nothing. So that was the problem with the messages.
Okay, okay. So later, when the Franciscans stepped in, the content of the messages improved, or what did they say now, then, as you see it?
They said nothing, basically. The Franciscans made sure that there was no theological errors in the messages, but there was no content either, and that was the problem. So the messages kept proliferating, and then there were different stories. Each of the children had to get 10 messages, then it would be other messages, and so on and so forth. So it got to the point where the story was completely contradictory, and then they would just forget about it, and it would go down the memory hole, and there would be no accountability anymore. They could say whatever they wanted, and that was that.
So, and about the local bishop and the bishop conference of former Yugoslavia, so we have here basically two competing stories now in the field. One is saying that from the very start, the bishops and the bishop conference opposed to the phenomena and claimed that it was fraud. And the other story says that basically the bishops were some for it, some skeptical, some not. But basically, the local bishop forced the entire bishop conference into making a negative vote.
Well, first of all, Bishop Zanic was the authority. He is the bishop, the local bishop. He is the authority on this matter. In terms of the other bishops, there was one bishop who was in favor of it, and that was Bishop Franic of Split, who was a charismatic. The other bishops were, I guess you'd say, in the middle of the whole thing. There was a back and forth, and finally the bishops' conference says that there was nothing supernatural about what's going on. That was the conclusion of the bishops. It was couched in words that were not strong enough. And so it did not bring closure to this issue. I met with Bishop Courage when I went back, and the new bishop, when I was back there in 1996. He said the position of the diocese was now not that they could not establish its supernaturality. He said now their position was they had established that it wasn't supernatural. That was the official position of the diocese. In other words, Courage was even stronger in his condemnation than Zanic was.
Okay.
When I went to talk to Bishop Zanic back in the summer of 1988, May of 1988, he told me he had just met with Cardinal Ratzinger, who was the head of the Congregation of the Faith. And I said, well, what did Cardinal Ratzinger say? And Zanic said he agreed with me that there's nothing supernatural going on here. And then Zanic told me, and then I met with the Pope. And I said, then what did the Pope say? And he said, the Pope said nothing. And I think that is the beginning of the issue here. The big issue, it's also the moment of transition when Međugorje became transformed from being a battle between the local bishop and the rebellious Franciscans. At this point, it became part of geopolitics. When I was in Rome, after I flew back from Međugorje, I flew to Rome, And when I was in Rome, I met with the United States ambassador to the Vatican, a man by the name of Frank Shakespeare. Met him at the Pacelli, the Domus Pacelli, the Pacelli family palace in Rome, very impressive place. I said to Frank, was the CIA involved in Međugorje? He said, I can't talk about that. And then he talked to me about the meeting that the Pope had with Ronald Reagan, in which Reagan proposed a way of ending the Cold War by defeating communism in Poland. Shakespeare was in on that meeting, actually talked to Reagan after it, and Reagan told him what was going on. I said, well, was Međugorje part of this campaign? He said, well, I can't really reveal to you what I was said at that point, but then he said, I can say that that is the type of movement that we would have supported. So I think this was Frank Shakespeare's way of saying, yes, the American, the CIA, the covert warfare apparatus in the United States got involved with Međugorje at this point. I subsequently wrote to the CIA under the Freedom of Information Act, and I got 19 pages of asking them for everything, all of their documents on Međugorje. I got 20 pages of documents back. 19 3/4 of the pages were blacked out. Now, obviously, I don't know what got blacked out, but I do know that that Međugorje was on their radar screen, that they were working in Međugorje, and that it was seen as a front in the final phase of the Cold War. I don't think there's any question in my mind. Now, this brings us back to the Pope. The Pope wanted to see the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. The Pope had been a bishop under communism in Poland. He was avid to bring an end to communism in Eastern Europe. I think he was avid for the return of a Catholic Croatia, for example. And so he went along with the Reagan covert war. And I think the consequence was that Pope John Paul II was never going to condemn Međugorje. That's the casualty that we had. And it did all sorts of damage to all sorts of people in the Catholic Church because he wouldn't condemn it.
Oh, that brings us to the fruits. So there, I mean, a lot of Croatian people go to Međugorje, and I know personally some of them, and I mean the feedback is very positive. They say a lot of nice things, good things. When talking about the fruits of Međugorje, what was your impression? What fruits have you seen there? And I mean, what
if you want my honest opinion, the main fruit of Međugorje for the little people who go there is broken marriages and disrupted family life. First of all, the fruits. When you talk about the fruits, you're automatically talking about a propaganda machine that eliminates everything negative that ever happened. This is obviously a distorted sense of what the fruits are. I can give you other examples. One of the main fruits of Međugorje was the destruction of Yugoslavia. I don't think that was a good fruit. Okay? But there are personal elements too. When I went back in 1996, there was a priest I met by the name of Father Philip Pavić, who was an American of Croatian descent, who had heard about it and then went to Međugorje and was a Franciscan there and was hearing confessions. By 1996, he no longer believed that there was anything legitimate about Međugorje. He was just looking for a way to get out. But during this period of time, he told me that Međugorje had become a stop on the whole New Age movement's world tour. Međugorje, he was telling me stories about what he had heard in the confessional of all sorts of occult happenings in Međugorje. Međugorje, because of the aspirations of the pilgrims, became infested with evil spirits. I'm talking about demons, fallen angels, devils. It was infested with evil spirits. Why did that happen? Well, if you read the church mystics, you'll understand that, because St. John of the Cross said, who was a mystic himself, said the devil rejoices when people seek private revelations. These are people who were basically spiritual tourists who thought that they could buy spiritual experiences by buying a plane ticket and flying to Međugorje. And the devil knew that, and the devil did not disappoint these people. There were all sorts of weird, preternatural phenomena that occurred there during this period of time. When I got back, after I'd written the second book, which was more geopolitical in its orientation, I got a call from a man from Boston, a Unitarian, okay, who had been asked by a bunch of pious Italian ladies to go to Međugorje. He told me, he said, something happened to me there and I've never been able to understand it. Can you explain it to me? He said, I was standing in the room of my bed and breakfast. The door was open, I was ready to go out to dinner, and suddenly a naked woman walked through the door. She walked across the room, and then she walked through the wall. And then he said to me, what do you think that was? I said, well, it probably wasn't the Blessed Mother. I said, do you know what angels are? He said, yeah. I said, well, there are good angels and there are bad angels. And what you saw was probably one of these bad angels. Okay? And Međugorje is infested with spirits like this. This is not, finally, in 2008, Bishop Puric of Mostar put Tomislav Vlasic's dossier. Tomislav Vlasic, by this point, had been not only suspended, he had been suspended in the, I believe it was the 80s, the 90s, for sexual misbehavior. At this point, he'd been defrocked. So if you see recent pictures of Tomislav Vlasic, he's no longer wearing the Franciscan habit. And around, I believe it was 2008, Bishop Puric posted Tomislav Vlasic's dossier on the Diocese of Mostar website, and it included not only sexual misbehavior, which we knew, I knew that from 1988, but also trafficking in spirits. So this confirmed what I had heard from other people. It's an extremely dangerous place spiritually. You can pick up a demon there the way you can pick up a disease in other places of the world.
So you never came across a good fruit, I mean a good experience, a conversion, or anything positive about Međugorje then?
I, personally?
Yes, if you have this feedback, I mean you done the research there, allegedly there, I mean people tell me that go there, that is a good place, that they charge their batteries, they come closer to God, they pray more frequently, I don't know. Do you have any?
Well, first of all, I can't explain other people's experiences. They have their experiences. There's nothing way I can argue with them. But
in your research, have anything positive came out of it? I mean, did you have some people with a positive, some as Paolo says, some toxic obručenja?
Father Pavić had to grapple with this thing. He said to me, he used to tell the pilgrims, just because you were born doesn't mean your parents were married. In other words, being born is a good thing. But the circumstances of your birth could be bad, too. It could be rape. It could be adultery. It could be any number of things. Artificial insemination. All sorts of... But the fact that you exist is a good thing. So the fact that someone had a good experience in there is not an argument that the thing is legitimate, any more than the fact that you say, well, I was born, therefore my parents were married. No, you can't argue in that direction.
Okay. Okay, if you could comment about the sheer volume of the messages. I mean, there are tens of thousands of messages coming out. What's the purpose here, and what's the credibility, again, of these new filtered messages, as you see it?
The purpose of these thousands of messages is to keep tourists coming to Međugorje so the money keeps flowing into their money-making operation. The number of tens of thousands of messages are proof that the messages are false. This is part of the criteria that the church uses. It has to be some type of limited, direct message. The fact that it's going on this long is proof that it's not legitimate.
Mr. Pavel wants to know some example of the first messages. How you distinguish the first messages were originally from children, like childish, compared to the later stage of the messages?
The first messages had absurd stories in them, like the one I mentioned, the bloody handkerchief story. After the Franciscans took control, all of these absurd stories were eliminated, and then the messages became banal and empty, which is the way they are today.
Okay, could you give us some more examples besides the handkerchief? Maybe if you remember.
I'm trying to. I'm not. None are occurring to me at this point, but I'd have to go back and reread that section of the book. The last book I wrote that book 20 years ago, so it's not fresh in my memory at this point.
Okay, well, let's talk about a bit about the end game. I mean the exit strategy from this situation. Can the church in any way, after all this local bishop condemnation and the parish condemnation and bishop conference, what are the options here? What can be done?
Okay.
What is possible?
You know that Cardinal Ruini was head of a commission to investigate Međugorje. Cardinal Ruini's commission has handed in its findings. They are basically on the desk of Pope Francis right now. The Pope has already made negative statements about Međugorje to the effect that the Blessed Mother is not a mailman who delivers his messages every day. Okay, so that's where it stands. We are simply waiting for the Pope to say something. This is a crucial moment because Međugorje is involved in all sorts of financial corruption. The Franciscans created a bank. They are involved in money laundering, and there are certain groups within the church who are profiting from this money laundering. The question, given what we know, given what Bishop Zanich and Perić have said, the church can never approve Međugorje. It will never happen. There's just too much negative evidence against it. The proponents of Međugorje know this, and so their strategy is simply not to get a positive statement, but rather to postpone any statement, any negative statement. And that's where it stands right now. The question is there going to be a statement? If there is no statement, it will mean that the forces of financial corruption still have the upper hand at the Vatican. The forces that I think led to the resignation of Pope Benedict. If there's no statement, it means that these people still have the upper hand.
What is the worst? I mean, regarding from the Franciscan perspective and the perspective of the one that benefits from Međugorje. What is the best that can happen, and what is the worst? I mean, can
the best, as I said, the church will never approve it. It will never happen. The best they can hope for is that there will be silence from the Vatican. This is the same silence that Bishop Zanich heard when he talked to the Pope, Pope John Paul II. Pope John Paul II wanted to use Međugorje as part of the anti-communist crusade. That's why he was silent. All the Franciscans can hope for is that the Vatican will maintain its silence on Međugorje so that they can continue to rake in the money. The best case, that's the best they can hope for. The worst is, of course, a specific condemnation of it. But at this point, it's going on for so long, it's not clear what effect that would have. It could be that the Franciscans, I don't think the Franciscans are going to end their rebellion no matter what happens, no matter what they say. Their rebellion is going on for too long. It's too deep-seated. I was in Choplina at the church. I saw the church where the cinder blocks have been bricked up the front door of the church. This is where Bishop Perić was assaulted, physically assaulted, attacked when he tried to get that church to return to under his jurisdiction. These people have been in rebellion for so long, I don't think a negative judgment is going to change them. They will continue to be in rebellion. They're just going to have to be, they'll all have to be defrocked, which is what happened to Tomislav Vlasic.
Can we, some kind of a judgment that says that is not supernatural, but happen. I mean, can...
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I can't hear you.
What if some kind of can there be some kind of a compromise decision like that is not supernatural, but I don't know, it's a place of worship?
No compromise is possible. This is the work of the devil. It has to be condemned as the work of the devil. If they say basically what you got with the bishop's statement in I believe that was 81. What was that? 91. Was a compromise where they said, oh, you can still go there, but not if you think it's supernatural. That was preposterous. It should have been condemned right then and there as the work of the devil, which is what it is. That's all it is. It has to be condemned. If they don't do that, then the Franciscans will have won. And there are powerful forces who are in the church who are getting money from this corruption who do not want to see their money ending, and that's the battle that's going to go on right now. No compromise is possible on this.
And then another question. Here in Croatia, that are, I mean, as way I see it, the Međugorje is not marketed. I mean, there are not many...
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Okay.
I can't hear you.
I'll be louder. So around here in Croatia, that is not much marketing for Međugorje. It's more like mouth to mouth. But as I understand it, in the United States, there are big marketing campaigns. And how come that the thing that you said it's a fraud had so many followers and so many pilgrims coming?
Why are there so many pilgrims? Was that your question?
That's right. Basically, yes.
There are, because of the chaos in the Catholic Church that has existed since the end of the Second Vatican Council. There's a crisis of authority in the Church. When the people don't get clear signals from the legitimate authority, they seek authorities elsewhere, and that's what these apparitions are. They play on people's needs for authority when the bishops are not exercising their authority properly. There are a host of phony apparitions in the United States. They are all a function of the chaos in the Church. Bayside is an example. Nisida before that. These are only the most famous. So it's a function of the chaos that has been created since Vatican II.
But what explains these huge numbers? I mean, that many pilgrims weren't flowing to Bayside or the other one you mentioned. There are millions of people coming to Međugorje. That must be some kind of marketing operation, or some, I don't know, or some experience.
Well, as I said, they got in at a crucial moment. When the world was poised to overthrow communism, the State Department or the CIA got involved in part of this thing. So it was just a much better marketing campaign. The problem with Bayside, for example, is that Veronica Lucan, the seer, did not have any priests, and so she to strain out the ridiculous messages that she was giving. So she put all kinds of grammatical errors into the mouth of the Blessed Mother because she was an ignorant woman. She'd say, the Blessed Mother would say, your medias are corrupt. Well, media is already plural, but Veronica Lucan did know that, okay? So the Blessed Mother was saying one absurd thing after another. The difference with Međugorje is that everything that got absurd, the absurd things that the children were saying, got strained out by all of these Franciscans with PhDs from German universities.
Okay, and how's the, let's say, the marketing or the pro crowd for Međugorje? I mean, the organizers of the pilgrimages that come from the States. How do they operate in your country? I mean, are they allowed? Are they sponsored by the churches or the?
Well, there's a conflict right now in every diocese in the United States because Ivan, who married Miss Massachusetts, was coming here and just fleecing the Catholics in diocese, every parish that he could get into. He'd collect money. And then he'd leave town with a lot of money and go back to Međugorje. The people complained, and then at a certain point, the bishops started cracking down. So the example I know is Joliet, Illinois. That diocese, Ivan was supposed to speak. Someone I know who had read my book wrote to the bishop and then banned him. That's the way things are happening now. So I think that that part is drying up. There used to be a Međugorje conference at Notre Dame University, which is near where I live. It is now, all of those people are now going to what is a Marian conference. So Međugorje is being eliminated. I think this is the bishop's attempt to take control of a phenomenon that basically got out of control. It was there, existed to challenge church authority. So I think it's heading in the opposite direction right now.
Well, here in Croatia we are not familiar with these Međugorje conferences. Can you explain us what happens at these conferences, how they look like, and what are they?
Well, it was a lot of personal testimony. You know, people would come and say, I went to Međugorje and my rosary beads turned gold and my life straightened out and I was a sinner and now I'm saved, and, you know, that type of thing. And then the seers would come and they'd have apparitions right there on the basketball court at Notre Dame, you know. It got so bad that Jozo Zovko was supposed to say Mass with the local bishop. I wrote to the local bishop and I said, are you going to say Mass with a man who's been suspended? Has no priestly faculties to do this? Well, the bishop didn't know this. So it turns out that Zovko was persuaded not to show up, and it didn't happen. But that's how bad it was in the 1990s. The bishops had no clue. They didn't know what was going on. It was this big international phenomenon, and everybody sort of jumped on the bandwagon. Well, I think things are changing now, and I think that I don't know when the Franciscans, the whole situation in Međugorje is so corrupt that I don't know whether they'll ever stop making money off of this operation. They may go on forever making money. But I think that the operation is closing down gradually in the diocese in the United States.
Okay. Okay, Mr. Jones, I think that's it.
All right.
Do you have something to add about it, or?
No, I think we covered all the bases.